Welcome to our session on open source. We started off, initially we were thinking we were going to talk mostly about open source clouds, but I think we're going to broaden it out and take a sort of a more general perspective on open source. I'm John Shillington. I'm VP Technology with Cybera, and open source is very much part of what we do. Open source tools is very much part of what we do. We contribute to open source projects, and as a not-for-profit organization, open source is a very interesting alternative for us to be able to propose to organizations of different sizes depending on their financial abilities and so forth. So just as one example, over the last couple of years, we've been working on a few projects that are building cloud infrastructure, so infrastructure as a service, similar to Amazon Web Services, but on a smaller scale and for private use by educational groups, academics, researchers, and Canary actually is one example. If you're interested in knowing more about Canaries Cloud, it's the digital accelerator for innovation and research, and we work together with them to help make that a reality. It's a pilot that's going on right now, and it's been very interesting. But one of the key aspects of that is the whole stack, the whole infrastructure stack, is based on open source software. We've got three knowledgeable and interesting panelists today. At the far end, we've got Kate Keahey, and I'll let Kate tell us a bit more about what she's doing.
Yeah. I'm a scientist at Argonne National Lab and University of Chicago, and quite a few years ago, in about 2003, 2004, we started working with scientists who wanted to deploy virtual machines on resources and came up with a system called Nimbus. It's an open source system that does, roughly speaking, what Amazon EC2 does, but it allows you to turn your cluster into a cloud. Right? So we had a production release at some point, and then we were surprised to find about a year later that somebody built a rather large commercial system based on a similar idea. Today, Nimbus provides an open source implementation of infrastructure as a service, but also infrastructure platform tools that use different deployments of infrastructure as a service, like OpenStack, Amazon, Eucalyptus deployments, to provide scaling services, contextualization services, or multi-cloud deployment and manage that reliably. We work solidly with open source community. It's a relatively small project. We've got about 13 plus contributors right now who contribute to the source, and a larger community who contributes a lot via testing and papers and research. And that's an amazing deal for us because we started out with one programmer moving to 2 and nowadays to 5. But the open source community help and the experience gained in that was very valuable to the project in general.
Our second panelist, thanks Kate. Our second panelist is Spencer Cox. He's Informatics Manager with Tesera Systems.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So I'm with a company called Tesera Systems. We're a services-based company and we do a number of things, but what sort of consolidates us all together is the need to manage landscape level data. We manage it, we analyze it, we distribute it, we do all sorts of things for clients ranging from small watershed groups to the insurance industry. And we have this corporate philosophy of kind of adopt, adapt, develop, and based on those rules, we've ended up doing a lot of work with open source projects. We're a big believer in the Open Geo Suite, and we've also kind of found ourselves in the cloud. That was kind of another direction. I mean, the reason we ended up there had more to do with just the cost of bandwidth in Alberta to simply get a T1 connection to our office. At the end of the day, we just, without all the other advantages considered, it was more worth it for us to move our entire infrastructure up there just to save on bandwidth. And then all the other machines and stuff were kind of a bonus. So we ended up in Amazon about 2 years ago, and since then we've expanded how we use it internally. We've also expanded how we use it for our clients in terms of all our hosted applications and that sort of thing. So we're doing a number of things, and then also the Water and Environmental Hub project, which is maybe going on next door right now. We're involved in that development as well. So maybe I'll try and offer a bit of a user perspective while we've got two excellent technical people that probably know a lot more than me about the details.
That's great. Thanks, Spencer. Our third panelist is Erik Michaels-Ober. He's Code for America Fellow, and maybe Erik, I'll let you tell the audience a bit about what that means.
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, I'm an open source developer, and mostly in the Ruby community. I work on a number of projects. RubyGems.org is probably the biggest one, and that's it's sort of like CPAN for Ruby. What CPAN is to Perl, RubyGems is to Ruby. So it's the central repository where if you create a new Ruby library, you can publish that and share it with the world. Everything on there is open source. You basically are just downloading source packages. And that's all the storage and distribution of those Ruby packages are done on S3, right? So it's a giant cloud service. It has something like 300 million downloads, maybe even more than that now, across all the different libraries in the Ruby community. So that's sort of one thing I do. I'm also an entrepreneur. I started a company a few years ago, and then I actually left that this past year to be a Code for America Fellow. And I don't know if you're familiar with Code for America here in Canada, but it's basically a fellowship program. You spend a year as software developers, designers, user experience and user interface people spend a year basically donating their time to help government understand technology better. So we're bringing open source to government, open data to government, and the general thrust is to get government on the cloud and thinking of themselves more as a platform provider, right? So governments typically think of themselves as a service provider. They're providing a service directly to the user. And what we're trying to do is get the government to think of themselves as a platform so that any citizen, especially citizen developers, can build upon that government platform and citizens can develop applications that are then the services that get provided to the user. It's much more cost effective for government to operate that way, and it also tends to result in better products, right? So the example in the US, and I'm sure there's an equivalent here, is there's a way to e-file your taxes, your annual tax return, online through the IRS website. In practice, nobody uses the IRS website. Everybody uses some service like TurboTax, which is sort of built atop that government e-file platform, right? And that helps people itemize their deductions and do all the things that you would want in a good service, but that the government doesn't have the right incentives to provide. So it's getting government to think about more services that can be provided that way.
That's great. I'm just going to flip this on. That fits in nicely with the open data theme as well, or it interleaves with the open data theme at the conference here. Okay, I'm going to walk through a few questions with you and see if we can shed some light on where open source is right now, what's driving it, and where it's eventually going to, and what we can look forward to. Just to start off with, I'll start with Kate. And just to sort of reiterate, so the different perspectives are, Kate's, among other things, actually built an open source cloud infrastructure and platform and tools on top of that. Spencer's using cloud platforms, and Erik's building tools that both use and expose open source services and open source code. So, Kate, I'll start with you. The question really is, what's pushing open source? There's been an enormous amount of energy, and certainly in the cloud community, phenomenal uptake on open source initiatives. So what do you think some of the drivers are?
So both open source and open data, and as to what's pushing it, I think it's different things for different people. So certainly in academia, which is mostly my background in academia and government labs, it's pushed by the need to innovate, or by seeing a new idea and how do we now expand that idea, right? And that doesn't go just to cloud computing per se. And then you support open source code development, of course, because we want to have a basis for experimentation. You want to extend that code, be able to add new features, experiment with new features, experiment with optimizations, and so forth. So people really feel that this open basis is important for that. Also, being open source, it helps you drive people from different backgrounds to code development. And that's really very important because for innovation in particular, because that drives new ideas into one area which might be a little bit inbred. And we're seeing this also in various initiatives like open data. People are much more interested in providing scientific data online. How do they do that, right? It's not just a question of putting data online. You also have to give people some ways of processing that data, of doing something with it, and it's very hard to do that unless they don't have, if they don't have access to a cluster, right? So then those people are talking, well, maybe we should put this data on the cloud, and then the people who want to do research with this data, process it in any way, can also do that in the cloud. So there's both this driver of innovation, and there's also this driver of enablement. We need to enable the open data and so forth, and therefore, cloud computing seems like a good paradigm to do that. In industry, I think the drivers are a little bit different because, the bottom line there is maybe not so much the research and innovate and come up with new things, but the bottom line is more in the way of making money, right? So what I see happening a lot with new technologies like, let's say, Cloud Foundry and the dangerously named OpenShift from Red Hat, what's happening there is that people are investing in the complements to their product, right? So if you have the sort of horse and carriage kind of situation that you can't have one without the other, right? If, for example, you're selling computers, but in order to buy a computer and use it meaningfully, people also have to invest in operating systems, browsers, word processors, email, and so on and so forth, right? They might not have the money to buy that computer, right? If they have to buy the computer and then the rest of the stuff comes for free, right? It's much more affordable for them to buy the computer, which means it's easier for you to sell the computer, which means you're motivated to invest in open source technologies to drive that market. And therefore you see people who sell computers investing in building cloud infrastructures, for example, because that means people might buy computers and build clouds. It's going to be much cheaper for them, right? Or people might buy a hypervisor and then also computers, but the cloud management infrastructure is going to come for free. So it's an emerging technology that creates a lot of business opportunity, and that's very strongly driving open source development. So I'm going to let some other people talk.
That's great. Spencer?
Sure. Yeah, if I was to take a stab at the same question, from a lot of our clients, it's the flexibility. For a lot of business cases, especially in the GIS world, there's sort of like this minimum size to participate threshold where just simply the complexity and the size of the software and the data that you need to run to, deploy even a basic mapping site or something like that means you have to almost be an enterprise to play. One thing that open source has really done for us is opened up the ability to develop and contribute interesting projects to smaller clients when arguably with much more interesting use cases. I'd mentioned the watershed groups as an example. For less than the price of a license for some of the major commercial players, they're able to, do this very innovative thing where they're able to offer, a real-time state of the watershed reporting module, have it all spatially linked up, have it using real data, for a cost that's manageable, and also because they're not linked to any specific end-user license requirement. They were able to collaborate with similar watershed groups and actually deploy it at other basins around the station where, if we had developed that on a more of a commercial stack, there would have been kind of barriers all the way through. I guess more from a, open source cloud perspective, maybe it's a little different again. And, we adopted Amazon basically because, it was the way to go commercially, I was ready to jump and use that infrastructure as a service level. But now it's pretty exciting to see kind of open source, maybe catching up or maybe even surpassing it, relatively quickly. Rackspace has got on board and others are coming online and OpenStack and this and that. And I think kind of where that's going is, people are gaining a comfort with open source and there's almost an expectation building for things to be transparent, things to be open. And, almost, kind of the opposite of having to pay to play on a big platform. Now you almost need to have that transparency in order for it to be taken seriously. So I think that's kind of an emerging business model for some of the bigger places.
Interesting. Yeah. And Erik?
Yeah, so Eric Raymond, who's a software developer and author, wrote an essay in 1999 that had a really big influence on me personally. It's called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and it's a great essay. I'd recommend everyone read it, especially if you're interested in open source. What he did is he talked about the motivations for open source and sort of described this cathedral model, which was written in 1999, so you can sort of imagine Microsoft was the target he had in mind, and their software development methodologies and the motivations that produce proprietary software, and what type of software results from having those motivations. And then he sort of contrasted that with open source, which is more of a Bazaar model, right? It's like this market, it's this open marketplace, and anybody can come and trade and give what they have to offer and take what they need. And sort of cutting to the chase, I'll spoil the essay for you a little bit. His conclusion was that people do open source. The core motivation for it is basically just scratching an itch, right? So there's some hacker out there, some person who has a problem that they need to solve, and they solve it, right? And they don't have a financial incentive. They don't care. They don't want to make money from it. They don't care that they have solved it, and therefore you shouldn't be able to. They just did it because they wanted to do it, and because they're not driven by a profit motive, they're happy to share that. And so, sort of thinking through that as the core motivation, I think the essay was basically correct, and the motivation in the 12 years since it's been written hasn't fundamentally changed. Why are people writing open source hypervisors now? I think you can look to that essay and say that's sort of the itch of the modern developer, right? That's the sort of interesting sort of connective tissue of the web that developers want to work on now and want to own and want to control. And there's some feature that doesn't exist in the proprietary version that they want to have, and so they're building it. And it's as simple as that, I think.
That's great. I mean, one thing that I've noticed is it's getting driven down. Open source is getting driven down lower. Well, I suppose Linux is a classic example of sort of being low in the stack, but it's connecting all the way up through from top to bottom, and now we're starting to see some hardware, open source hardware and data center plans and models as well. So it's kind of working its way ubiquitously. I think we'll actually have a speaker tomorrow afternoon talking about an open source combination of OpenStack and hardware base. From a development perspective, you've kind of said it's scratching an itch for developers, but just sort of more generally, what are some of the sort of valuable features from a developer's perspective about going with open source? So yeah, sure. Why don't we go back to the system?
So there's a number. One is control, right? So the biggest one is control. Maybe that's not the biggest one. One of the big ones is control. So if you're dependent on some proprietary software provider to add a feature, you're not in control, right? You can ask them nicely. You can offer to give them more money. But if their priorities aren't aligned with your priorities, at some point there's only so much you can do to control the actual software you're using. If there's a bug that you find and you want to fix it, if you don't have access to the source code, you don't have the ability to do that. So that's a huge piece of it, and that's, I think, one of the biggest sort of selling points of open source, especially from a developer's perspective. You want control. You want the ability to fix fix a bug or improve software at every level in the stack. And I think the other big advantage of open source as a process is speed, development speed, and the ability to leverage a network well beyond yourself or your company to work on something. So as an example, I also work on a project called Rails Admin, which is basically just an admin interface for the Ruby on Rails web framework. And this project has over 100 contributors around the world. It's been translated into 22 languages. That's something I never would have been able to do by myself. and certainly not as quickly, right? So you sort of, by opening up your project, it gives you, and I think Firefox is another great example of this, by having an open source project, you have an asymmetric advantage. How could anyone beat Microsoft in the web browser space, right? How could anyone get any traction in that market? But Mozilla and Firefox was able to do that. The reason they were able to do that is because it wasn't just one company in one city, you know, in Washington. It was people from around the world who wanted to sort of scratch that itch, make a better web browser. They were frustrated by what was out there. They wanted the control of an open source project. And by all those people coming together, they were able to leverage that, that collective effort against the sort of biggest and most powerful company in the world at the time.
You can go ahead.
Okay. All right. I actually wanted to agree very strongly to what you alluded to earlier in the Bazaar versus Cathedral model. Open source development does result in better quality of code because you have to code in a special way if you're going to work with a group of people who you potentially don't know, you don't know their level of expertise, how they code and so forth, and you have to write the code in a special way such that it makes it easy for others to extend. And that is a lot better because that person you don't know could be yourself 10 years from now, down the road. And you will need to deal with that code extended, and it's just having a good structure, having a structure that responds to that kind of development means a lot. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is that open source development, in my experience at least, fosters a great culture, and this is one of the things that developers also like. So you alluded to the social aspects of the open source coding, but you know, the type of people who gets attracted to open source projects very often are, you know, we get it done type of people. They come to us because they found a bug that they fixed. They typically start by giving us fixes. They typically start by saying, your code does, you know, 95% of what we need to do. Here's the remaining 5. So those are people that are very confident in their expertise, very savvy, very on the ball, very generous also. And those types of people work together very well. So that's one of the joys of working with that.
Yeah, I'd probably come at it almost the same way. Like for us, it's been mostly about adaptability. You mentioned the 95. I was going to say 80. You know, it's so often that you actually look at vendor solutions, you look at open source solutions. You find so many that are so close to, you know, almost doing exactly what you want, but they just need to do this one other thing. It's pretty nice to be able to adapt that 80 or 95% piece of code. And then contribute it back to the community. You know, they get a little bit more features. Meanwhile, you've met your business requirements and hopefully moved on in a more efficient method than had you had to build that whole 100% of that piece.
That's great. Okay, so the flip side of that is what are the sort of the big challenges? What are the things that are most likely to slow down or break an open source community? So maybe we'll let Spencer take that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe less so directly from the community side, but more so the challenges we face with, you know, implementing and getting adoption with open source projects is where I can come from. And the biggest thing is, you know, in a lot of enterprises, you know, where there's, you know, a tight vendor relationship or whatever, there's kind of a lack of trust even to this date with just the whole word open source. You know, open source, even cloud, and, you know, God forbid, open source cloud. People get, you know, fairly nervous because it's not what they know. You have a lot of large deployments where, you know, it might be a Microsoft shop or whatever. You know, it's a big shift. One, it would be monumental for them to implement, and, you know, to do it with small pieces. Then they start worrying about, well, you know, now I got to support this piece along with everything else. And you know, it's a bit of a thinking shift. And I know, you know, tracking the literature and, you know, the analytics that are out there, there are more and more companies that are, you know, using it in their business critical applications. But, you know, working in Alberta, working with the oil and gas industry and, you know, some of these more conservative industries, it's a pretty big thing to wrap one's head around for them. And, you know, if they don't see the immediate need, maybe the cost isn't the issue for them. It's just not something they really want to delve into. So from us, it's been a challenge of, you know, even if it does offer a better solution, you know, it's still not something our clients always want to take on.
I was going to take the devil's advocate and say there aren't any. It's all going to be open source in the future.
Just shut your mic off.
But there are probably some challenges in terms of reputation. So, a lot of companies that maybe don't have a very good business model try to use open source as, this is our original offering, and then we'll sell you a real version, or this is our open source is kind of a demo version. We'll sell you the real product for much more money, and that gives open source sometimes a little bit of a bad name, because you get something that is open source, and all of a sudden you find that you don't have good support, that the software is not reliable, and so forth and so on. So there is a perception then growing that open source is kind of not for real uses, and that is something that is not very good for the development of open source.
Yeah, it would be nice. I wish there were no disadvantages. That would be a great world. I think there's actually a lot of disadvantages. So you sort of touched on one, which is that open source is it's fundamentally a software development sort of methodology and culture, and there's not the same software development or open source methodology in design culture or in customer support culture. The number of people who are willing to sort of write code in an open source way and contribute it and get back the rewards that come from doing that, there's not a lot of people who want to provide open source technical support, right? The motivations are different. There's not a lot of designers who are doing that. And so I think when you look at the successes of open source projects, it's typically pretty low level stuff, right? Bind, it's like incredibly low level, runs the internet, open source, SendMail, Apache, Linux, right? These are all like pretty low level technologies. And when you look at things like attempts like OpenOffice, they're pretty disastrous. I think Firefox is sort of the rare exception to that. But open source, I think, only has the ability to, when it comes to high-level products like that, the user-facing products, it seems like they have the ability to sort of maybe copy the status quo and maybe do like 30% better or something like that, right? But when you really need a coordinated effort of like multiple people coming together and doing revolutionary change, making a revolutionary new web browser, not just an evolutionary one, not just IE, but faster and better, and maybe the animation smoother or something, right? But really thinking about like a new product category, I think that's hard because it actually requires more than just like one person. Open source is fundamentally distributed, right? The people aren't working in close quarters, and things that benefit from that, right? Like big revolutionary steps in product. It's very, very hard to get those from open source because of the sort of distributed nature of it. So in some way, the distributed nature is its asymmetric advantage, but that doesn't map well to every type of software product.
I think one of the other things you mentioned, OpenOffice. One of the other difficulties, or one of the things to consider, is the switching cost. So, switching cost from my Office infrastructure, if I don't have perfect conversions between the document types, means it's going to be painful. And if it doesn't work out, it's a disaster. Right. Switch over to Firefox, it takes me 10 minutes.
Right, but I mean, cost aside, I mean, I think it would be pretty hard to make the case that OpenOffice is a better product. I think most users would not prefer to use OpenOffice over Microsoft Word, any of the proprietary Office suites out there.
Yeah, that's true. On the other hand,
even if there was no friction in switching, even if they had perfectly reverse engineered all of the, because now, like the latest Microsoft Word document format, all the Microsoft Office document formats are actually open formats. I think Microsoft has submitted them to standards bodies, and they're XML based. And so the compatibility thing isn't really an issue anymore. It certainly was when open source was when OpenOffice was getting off the ground, but it's not an issue anymore, and you still don't see massive adoption of OpenOffice, even though it's free.
Right. Well, we should talk more about this after, but Google Docs has sort of introduced a different model that actually may switch things, but that's for a different discussion. So the next question is, you know, as much as anything from, well, it's partly from a user's perspective, but it's also as a developer, you have choices of what to incorporate into your work, and some of those will be open source, and some of them will be proprietary. And the question is really about how to navigate that and how to make those decisions. So, Kate.
Yeah, well, I think that from users' perspective, the choice is relatively simple, right? If you're minimally technology savvy and will be able to provide minimum support such as installation, maybe open source is for you. Otherwise, no, right? If you're going to have to customize the software, then definitely use open source. If you're going to if this is an emerging technology, which is going to change a lot and which may benefit by very rapid innovation, then definitely use open source, right? So all those things make open source more attractive to users. From the development perspective, I think it depends a little bit on who you are, or, you know, from an organization perspective, maybe rather choosing open source over proprietary solution. It depends a little bit on what you see as your operating strength, you know, what the costs you want to incur. In some instances, the choices are the same as the choices for the user. So in other words, if this is an emerging technology, open source is of benefit to you because either you or others will customize it. So I think it very much depends on your ability to open yourself up to innovation, understanding that innovation might have some consequences in terms of ease of use, but also in terms of what you can customize and how you can mold the product or provide additional products in conjunction.
Spencer?
Sure. Yeah, no, good question. I kind of still struggling with the previous question in a way too, because one of the things that open source has enabled, so to speak, is, you know, software as a service, and, you know, more and more that's become the user expectation. And one thing that, you know, one of the potential challenges is by enabling software as a service, you know, it's a little bit harder to deploy a service as an open source. You know, it's not something you can package and distribute like you can in an open source package. I mean, nobody's just going to give you a free cloud to run your service on. So kind of going forward, you know, when you're looking for that option, it kind of ties, you know, that aspect of maybe users are looking for more of a service-based thing where less and less they want to worry about the maintenance, the support, the updates, whether that's something they've installed or something they're accessing on the web. It really comes down to the feature set around that. So, yeah, I mean, the way we've dealt with it at Tesera is, you know, simply adopt, adapt, develop. If there's something that does basically what you need to do, and you can adopt it and save yourself that whole support burden, you know, it's great. But then if that use isn't available, you know, then you start stepping down the ladder, and hopefully you can adopt something, and worst case you build it from the ground up. But yeah, I think software as a service is throwing an interesting angle into sort of how you perceive this question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, you know, it's like you ask this panel, you know, how do you choose between open source and proprietary solutions? So we're biased. I'll admit that, but and I completely would just sort of echo what Kate and Spencer said. You know, maybe I'll talk a little bit about my experience this past year in Code for America working with government, because government's sort of an interesting consumer of technology. Typically, the trend in America and probably other places as well is as government is looking to reduce costs, it's getting rid of a number of internal IT people. They're basically getting rid of them to, you know, lower their costs, and replacing them with contractors. And again, like in the same way there are in open source designers and open source customer support people, there's not nearly as many open source sort of salespeople and contractors as there are people offering proprietary solutions, and so the government almost always selects them. I think another reason why government is selecting proprietary solutions typically is because they don't have the technical expertise, because they've fired the internal people who have that. And the other reason is because government is a very risk-averse entity, right? Politicians don't want to take the blame for any decision. And if you have an internal employee of the government who makes a mistake, the server goes down or something like that, then the politician will look foolish, right? It's a mistake that happened within government. But by sort of doing it through contractors can have service level agreements that governments are much more comfortable with, and if something goes wrong, they can say, oh, you know, don't blame us, it's, you know, IBM's fault or Microsoft or Esri or Oracle, right? All these companies are sort of selling to government in a way that government is very receptive to because it's so risk averse. And I think that's sort of like an interesting, Code for America is kind of at the nexus of that because we're trying to bring open source to government in a way that's not scary to them. And we're trying to be that force that says, hey, if something goes wrong, it's on us, just blame Code for America. But chances are it won't go wrong because what we're doing, the technologies that we're bringing to government are typically like 10-year-old technologies, right? And they're proven to work. We're not doing a ton of innovation in government. It's just government, because it's 10 years out of date, by using modern best practices is actually like a huge leap forward for government. Right. And because they're under so much financial pressure, because those cost-cutting forces are in place, actually open source is an attractive alternative with Code for America because it tends to be cheaper than the solutions that are being offered by some of the proprietary providers. So that's sort of where Code for America's opportunity is being realized.
It's really interesting, and it sort of leads into our next question, I think. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
I just wanted to add one thing. You brought up risk, and that's something that I feel open source is very good at mitigating. So, for example, a much appreciated feature of open source is the more trust in security features, right? Because more eyes are looking at that code. And I've had numerous students report various security bugs and so forth. So because of that, because of a wider review, you end up essentially with a more secure code. Another issue is vendor lock-in, right? If vendor lock-in is something that you're worried about, open source gets you out of that hole. So it's another risk mitigation feature.
Right. So I completely, I think a technical person sees the issue that way. I think a politician, when confronted between a technical person and a salesperson who's sort of promising a service level agreement, will typically take the service level agreement over the sort of faith that that, oh, if something goes wrong, all we have to do is apply the security patch. So I agree with you. I mean, open source technologies have a much better track record for things like security, but I think there's some messaging or something that we as an open source community have to do to get over that hurdle. Yeah. I think it's still a hurdle. It's a story we need to be able to tell.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
We're coming close to the end, but I do want to get to this last question, so maybe we can just ask each of you to sort of briefly tell us what you think's on the horizon for open source. How is it going to evolve? I think you've started to answer that question, Erik, from your perspective with Code for America. Maybe I'll start with Spencer.
Sure. So yeah, and I'm sure Erik can speak way more to this, but in my experience, government seems to be fairly proactive in terms of at least willingness to consider. I mean, in the EU, there is a big procurement guideline released about considering open source first and the reasons to do so. We're starting to see this in municipalities, maybe partially related to the open data movement. Municipalities around Alberta that we work with. So it's getting over the bad reputation in my mind that really brings the future. And not that it's a bad reputation, it's more so just a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge about open source. And I think as you do get some of these more major municipalities or governments starting to say, it's good enough for us, so maybe you can consider it too as a business, I think that's going to help, break things down, and, we'll really start to see momentum, grow beyond what it's at right now.
Yeah, so I think that one interesting development that is making open source development easier and open data and open other things easier is the development of social networks, because all of a sudden it's becoming easier to contribute. It's much easier to contribute code to a project using GitHub, for example, than if you're working in a CVS framework. So that technology, I see that as having a very visible, very tangible even impact on how many people are looking at open data, open source. So it's a very clear technological enabler. To speak to clouds in particular, we've seen like explosion of various different technologies in the cloud. So going back to early 2000s, well, we had like two two virtual machine monitors, I should say. There was the user mode Linux, which was open source and free, but it was very slow. And there was VMware, which was, the performance was acceptable of the more sophisticated versions, but they were very expensive. They were $5,000 a license. So when I was trying to convince various people to deploy virtual machines on remote resources, they would come to me and say, why should I pay $5,000 for a virtual machine if I could get a real one for that amount of money, right? So there was a very clear impediment, a very clear barrier, and that all just got blasted away when Zen came out in 2003, and it got blasted away for two reasons. It was very highly performing, and it was open source, and that meant two things. One, that it was free, and secondly, that all of a sudden there was a very active contributor community that grew up around it. So, at the beginning, Zen was not a perfect technology, but its imperfections improved at a very high rate. So first we saw a wave of open source hypervisor development. Then we saw a wave of open source infrastructure as a service development, of which Nimbus was one, but we've got OpenStack now, we've got Eucalyptus, we've got various other open source implementations. And that very recently, within the last few months, we started seeing infrastructure platform technologies coming out, and they are coming out as open source. So there is Cloud Foundry from VMware, there's the OpenShift technology from Red Hat. We are investing in cloud platform technologies also. There is a lot of interest that got enabled by those open source infrastructure as a service projects, right? Because people started building more clouds. Now we have many clouds. How do we now work between those clouds? How do we work by drawing resources from those different clouds? So a problem got created. The problem is being solved by an open source technology that gives you a better innovation platform. So in terms of what's next, well, what will those platform technologies enable? They will probably enable more software as a service on that stack. So that would be my take on what will happen in the cloud technology.
I would go back to Eric Raymond's essay about what motivates open source development to try to think about what the future of open source looks like, and so what are sort of the itches that will what will future developers itches be, right? Is the question, and I think there's going to be if you look at mobile, that's probably, right now it's one of the fastest moving spaces, fastest evolving. It's also one that's largely been untouched by open source. You can sort of make a case that Android is open source, but I would actually argue that it's not. I would argue that Android is this different sort of thing, which is source available. But to make the distinction between people who are putting the source out there and actively looking for contributions and people to improve it, or basically just to be open source in name only. And so, there's this huge mobile wave. If you think about what a mobile phone looked like 5 years ago versus 3 years ago versus today, they're almost not recognizable as the same device. And largely, they're not the same device. If you look at the internal components, they're completely changed. And so, and every day, new phones are getting new sensors that weren't there before, and new capabilities that don't even exist on my laptop, right? My cell phone has an accelerometer in it and GPS, and I would love to have GPS in my laptop, right? But this device, which is a fraction of the size and a fraction of the cost, has all these new sensors and new technologies, but you don't really see a huge amount of open source development in that space. So to me, that's sort of what's exciting to me, and yeah, something that I'm be interested in working on in the future.
Great. Well, thanks very much to all of you. I'm going to open the floor up to questions now for a few minutes. So we'll start.
Hi, I just wanted to make a couple statements. I'm a systems administrator working mostly with open source systems like Linux. I think the biggest thing in terms of people being scared of letting people do technical things is that if you don't let technical people do technical things, then they're not technical anymore. You know what I mean? Like, so if there's organizations that are scared that using open source is too technical, then you're going to end up having people that aren't technical, the people that work there. You have people end up being just like a pair of hands on the end of a phone. So I think it's important that technical people be allowed to be technical and to learn new things, and a good way to do that is to use open source systems.
I couldn't agree more. It's true, I think, but I think that there's another way of saying that people are not necessarily so worried that they will have to be technical people, that technical people will have to support that product, but that the cost of that support may be overwhelming. And that goes a little bit to what I was saying about the reputation of open source, that sometimes it gets reputation for being unreliable and so forth. So people are not necessarily thinking very often, at least in my experience, in terms of, you know, we will have to have a certain level of expertise that we don't have, but we'll have to hire more people to run an open source solution than we would running a proprietary one.
Got a question over here and then a couple over here.
Good morning, and thank you so far for the viewpoints, which I agree with for the most part. But one of the things that strikes me is that much of what we've been talking about here has been applicable to open source in general, that this is true of Firefox versus IE, or you know, open source virtualizing versus paid for virtualizing and so on. Cloud, it seems to me, has the potential to be bigger and riskier, and I'm wondering whether the same drivers for open source that allow you to choose a free desktop communications package versus a paid for one will still apply when we're talking about, in a business or a government context. You know, what are really potentially mission critical application deployments, mission critical data security. Is the same motivators for open source going to work in an environment where historically people have, and the point was made, people are looking for one throat to choke, and there's a lot more riding on some of these decisions, I guess, is what I'm asking, and I'm not convinced that the open source model will translate into that level of comfort for mission critical kinds of environments.
I've got an opinion on that, but maybe, okay, well, I'll dump out my opinion. Well, it's more than an opinion, it's fact-based. There's one, I think your intuition is what I would have expected as well a year or two ago without seeing what's happened. The reality is, though, that there's been an enormous groundswell behind these, and they are being adopted by large organizations at scale. So, so for whatever reason, there's commercial organizations are jumping in and actually contributing to and supporting this in a very big way. So I was looking at OpenStack, for example, has over 115 organizations that are supporting it, including some very, very big anchors. So I think the reality is that surprisingly, it looks like they in fact are going to be reliable and supportable and adopted by large organizations.
I would just say I don't actually think it is riskier. I think the sort of challenges the cloud faces today are as big and risky as the challenges people faced maybe 5 years ago with databases, or 10 years ago with databases. So, you know, as an example, Google decided originally to store all of its data in MySQL databases, right? Which is an open source database. They could have stored it in Oracle, but they made sort of the best technological decision, and as a result of that, it was a huge decision for them at the time, right? They didn't think like, oh, where are we going to put our data? It's this flimsy open source database. They just picked the best database, and they picked the open source database. And I think the same way now, people will continue to just pick the best, you know, way to host their products on the internet, and I don't see any sort of fundamental reason why open source would be riskier. I think there's actually some compelling reasons why it wouldn't be, right? Because you have a more distributed nature, fewer single points of failure. You're not relying on a single provider, things like that.
Yeah, I was going to actually say pretty much exactly what you said. You know, operating systems seemed pretty risky to some people at some point, and yet here we are, right? I think that far from being riskier, they are actually less risky. So open source cloud implementations will be less risky because of the, you know, more eyes looking at the code factor, more eyes looking for security, potential security pitfalls. The big issue here was there going to be enough support behind this to create a real open source project, so something not dominated by one company. I think I see that actually as one of the greatest risks to open source development on a single product is one company domination, right? OpenStack is a product right now which has many different stakeholders contributing to it, and that mitigates that factor. So you get, in a sense, best of the both worlds, right? You get the good coding practices that you brought up at the beginning, the way that the code is structured that enables contributions. You get the many eyes looking at the stuff, and you also get risk mitigation in terms of investment in the project and control over the project.
I might just add quickly that in my mind, there's no fundamental difference, but it becomes more of an operational issue. Even in Amazon, there's risky practices, there's risky deployments. You could probably do the same thing on OpenStack. You could create a very fragile cloud if you wanted to, or didn't have the resources to do it well. So I think, the operational dependencies of whether somebody is really in the infrastructure as a service game, or whether they just, deployed a small cloud as a pet project and decided to throw a mission-critical application up there, it becomes more of an operational question than a fundamental question, in my opinion.
Great. We had a question from Lady. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Robert?
This will be the last question.
Yeah.
Of the conference or just? Yeah, I have a small cloud project, and I'm sort of interested in your comments about risk with using open source, and I think there's a lot more risk than you might be acknowledging in that this technology is very new. And for example, a year or two ago, we made a choice to go with a particular open source software for our cloud, and really it just did not work out. And I think one of the issues is that when you run into difficulties with open source, there's no guarantee that you can get technical support. And in our case, even though we had some training take place with this open source group, at the end of the day, with the difficulties they were having, they just basically stopped answering questions, and ultimately that open source software was thrown away, and we had to start over again. So if you are going to jump in and use open source, you really have to be thinking about how well developed is that. If you get in too early, then you are in fact taking on a lot of risk.
I think that's a great point. I've worked with Robert on that very project, and it was a really painful decision to switch from one to another. Yeah. I think part of it has to do with what Kate pointed out about being reliant on a single company, but also, as you say, Robert, it's the maturity the maturity of it when you join.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say two things. One is there is a technology risk in adopting a new emerging technology, and cloud computing is still an emerging technology. This risk is technology specific rather than open source specific necessarily. But I completely understand what you're saying about not getting support. I've seen that happen on many projects, And this is the unfortunate, well, this is a little bit what I was talking about, the reputation, right? Sometimes the software and the hype cycle nowadays, sometimes software gets put out that is perhaps not as advertised or not quite as advertised. And then it's very sad because people take it as reflection on open source that you never get support, which I don't think is true generally of open source. But it is definitely true of certain projects. And given the culture, the kind of media-oriented culture that we live in, and the importance of hype and jumping on the bandwagon and so forth, you're unfortunately going to deal with overhyped and over-advertised technologies. And the only thing I can say is that probably that means that in the world that we live in, we have to do very careful research on what technology we're going to adopt. And it looks like you were essentially doing research and you decided to not adopt that technology, which sounds like a right decision based on what you described.
Any final comments?
I would add, the way I think about technical support with open source is that you are the technical support, right? And if you're a software engineer, that statement probably inspires confidence, right? The fact that you have the ability to solve your own problem is actually one of the things that's really empowering about open source. And if you say that to a non-technical person, it probably doesn't inspire confidence, right? You don't want to be the support. You want to call. You don't want to be the expert. You want to call someone who's the expert, who's going to come in and fix your problem. And ultimately, I used the MySQL example earlier around to the first question around risk. And what's interesting is that through Google's evolution, they actually sort of graduated from that, and they're not using MySQL anymore, right? They invented their own database that's specific to the problem that they're solving. And so the open source solution sort of provided a solution at a period in time, and Google actually put a lot of work while they were using it into optimizing MySQL. MySQL got dramatically better in the first few years that Google used it because they were pushing it in ways that nobody had ever pushed it before. And then they stopped contributing to it because they just pushed it so far that it sort of became a thing that it wasn't a general purpose database anymore. It was something that just was a giant web index, and they built something that was sort of more conducive to that. But without that level of sort of technical expertise if the source code needs to be your documentation, right? Open source doesn't come with a manual other than the source code. And if you're not comfortable with that being the manual, and you're not comfortable getting in there and sort of supporting it yourself, then I agree. There's really not a great support story around many open source technologies. Some, Red Hat has built a business around supporting open source, but in general, I tend to not like that model because I think it actually gives them the wrong incentives, because Red Hat is both developing their product, and they're also, the way they make money from it is through support, and I think that gives them an incentive to make it be hard to use and poorly documented, basically. Because as soon as it's not, they're undercutting their own business. And so
I'm going to take a little bit of issue with that because, I think that open source code should be production quality code, and that means competent documentation and competent testing practices and, competent advertising or truth in advertising and all of those things. And, there are good open source projects and bad open source projects. It looks like you walked into a bad one. But in general, I think that, you can advertise your project as a research project, and then you're talking about different quality software than a production quality software. But, I've seen well-staffed projects of very competent people struggle with an open source solution that they expected to work that didn't work to them in the end. And not everybody starts out on a project expecting to develop their own solution in the end, right? If you do, then the Google story is a very good example of how you might. But I would say that most people who just want to use open source product, they want to use it as a product. They don't want to use it as a stepping stone to doing something themselves.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap up there, but I'm sure that we could go on for quite a while, actually. This is just opening up a whole new vista. Anyway, I'd like to thank our panelists very much for your contributions. And yeah, please, round of applause for inviting me. Peace.